I'm James McIlvenney, and you're listening to the History and Philosophy of the Language Sciences podcast, online at hi-fi-langsci.net. There you can find links and references to all the literature we discuss. With this episode, we arrive definitively in the second half of the 19th century. To orient ourselves in this environment, we're going to look at the work of one of the most outspoken and influential figures at the dawn of this period, the American Sanskritist and general linguist William Dwight Whitney. Whitney was a great polemicist. That's to say, he wasn't shy about criticizing other scholars. And through his critiques, he highlighted some of the excesses in linguist conceptions of language in this period. But Whitney wasn't just a scold. He also offered up novel theories on the nature of language and its study that would inspire the next generation of linguists. It's this combination of critiquing the leading ideas of the time and developing his own views that makes Whitney such an excellent marker for navigating the intellectual landscape of this period. There were two main positions on the nature of language that dominated academic linguistics around the middle of the 19th century. We met these in episodes 5 and 6. The first of these views is that associated with August Schleicher, which treats language as something akin to a natural organism. Whitney called this position the physical theory of language. The second view is that associated with Steinthal, which grew out of Steinthal's interpretation of Wilhelm von Humboldt and his work with Lazarus on Völkerpsychologie. Steinthal saw language above all as a window onto the workings of the human mind. In addition, he saw the peculiarities of individual languages as a key to the Volksgeist of their speakers. Whitney called Steinthal's view the psychological theory of language. In a number of essays, lectures, and books from the 1860s to the early 1870s, Whitney went into battle against both these positions. Schleicher's physical theory, he argued, was the result of taking a useful metaphor, language as organism, and treating it as if it were a literal truth. To imagine that languages have a life of their own, that their historical development is in some way similar to that of a living organism, might be a handy heuristic in describing historical changes languages undergo, but it's fundamentally wrong to assume that this provides a philosophically sound basis for accounting for their real existence. Steinthal, and Humboldt before him, didn't fare any better in Whitney's estimation. In a nutshell, Whitney disliked their work because he felt they engaged in too much speculative philosophy. In Whitney's view, the linguist should start from facts that can be established empirically by observing languages, and build on top of this solid foundation. But Steinthal and Humboldt, he believed, start at the wrong end. Their approach is to pose deep, metaphysical questions about the nature of language and the human mind, and then to look for concrete evidence to support these conjectures. Whitney accepted that we might one day be in a position to pose such questions and answer them profitably, but first we need to get the facts straight. According to Whitney, Steinthal's psychologism and Schleicher's physicalism blind them to the true nature of language. Against their views, Whitney claimed that language is above all an activity in which people engage in order to communicate with one another. We should let Whitney speak for himself on this point. In his 1867 Language and the Study of Language, a book which began life as a series of lectures delivered to a general audience at the Smithsonian Institution, he said, "Language is, in fact, an institution, the work of those whose wants it subserves. It is in their sole keeping and control. It has been by them adapted to their circumstances and wants, and is still everywhere undergoing at their hands such adaptation. Every separate item of which it is composed is, in its present form, for we're not yet ready for a discussion of the ultimate origin of human speech, the product of a series of changes, effected by the will and consent of men, working themselves out under historical conditions and conditions of man's nature, and by the impulse of motives which are, in the main, distinctly traceable and form a legitimate subject of scientific investigation." Let's unpack what Whitney's getting at here. The problem is that languages do seem to have an independent existence beyond their speakers. Historical changes in sounds and meaning of words seem to occur without the intervention of speakers, and indeed even against the conscious efforts of speakers to fix languages. The story of comparative historical linguistics up to this point has largely been about identifying the rules governing these changes. Schleicher's physical theory arises from taking such rules as its starting point and assuming that they describe the real independent life of languages. Steinthal's psychological theory makes a similar move, but locates these speaker-independent rules in the mental rather than the physical realm. Against this common assumption, Whitney argued that languages are indeed shaped by the individual actions of their speakers. It's just that speakers don't necessarily perform their actions consciously, and that the changes they effect occur so gradually that they escape immediate notice. Whitney points out that speakers innovate in their languages all the time by creating new words or new senses of words. But individual speakers don't have the power or the right to determine whether these innovations will be taken up into the language. This is decided by the entire speech community. However, some individuals might have more influence because they hold a position of authority or their words may be considered to be particularly apposite or eloquent. When a new form finds recognition in the community and is reproduced, it gradually comes to be considered a normal part of the language, and a change has taken place. Whitney believes that this principle applies not only to words, the most tangible components of language for us as speakers, but also to more subtle features of languages, such as grammar and phonology. Some speakers may innovate new grammatical constructions or pronunciations, and these may then be taken up by the wider speech community. This alternative view of the nature of language led Whitney to apply new methods. For example, he used statistics to study historical sound change, the main interest of comparative historical linguistics. The most notable example of this can be found in his 1874 essay, Elements of English Pronunciation, where he tabulated the occurrence of different speech sounds from corpora he compiled of contemporary English and earlier varieties of Germanic and Indo-European languages, going all the way back to Sanskrit. With these statistics, he was able to show the general tendencies of sound change in the history of Indo-European languages, up into present-day English. One of the tendencies Whitney observed in the long history of Indo-European is to reduce the openness of vowels. He found that in Sanskrit and the older Indo-European languages, there's a much higher occurrence of the vowel ah, pronounced with the mouth fully open. According to his statistics, in Sanskrit this vowel occurs 70% of the time in comparison to other vowel sounds, and 30% in comparison to both vowels and consonants. In the oldest Germanic dialect, this rate of occurrence falls to 14% of all sounds, in German to 5%, and in Whitney's English to 0.5%. In his own speech, Whitney says, ah is the rarest of all vowel sounds. The explanation Whitney offers for this development is conservation of effort on the part of speakers. To pronounce the vowel ah, we have to open our mouths wide. By contrast, the other vowel sounds that have become more frequent over time are made with the mouth less wide open and so require less effort to articulate. This development, Whitney claims, is a manifestation of the more general tendency to economy, which he holds up as a general principle of language change. Speakers always aim to put the least amount of effort into producing their utterances. This applies not only to pronunciation, but also leads to the simplification of grammar and words. So to explain language change, Whitney doesn't look to laws of nature or the putative functioning of the human mind, but rather focuses on the mundane facts of day-to-day interaction of speakers using language. But why did Whitney think of language in such a radically different way from his contemporaries in Germany? Where did his conception of language come from? This idea of variation within the speech community, and then selection of variants for further propagation, is of course much more in tune with the principles of Darwinian evolution than Schleicher's self-professed Darwinian linguistics, which we encountered in episodes 5 and 6. In this respect, we can see that Whitney was in fact closer in spirit to Darwinism than many of his contemporaries in linguistics. But there's a more fundamental difference between Whitney and the leading German linguists, namely Whitney's claim that language is an institution, a set of conventions that people maintain in order to communicate. This view represents a revival of ideas put forward by Enlightenment-era empiricist philosophers, which we discussed briefly in episode 3. We'll recall that the English empiricist John Locke famously argued for the arbitrary nature of language. That is, he believed that there is no necessary connection between words and their meanings. Rather, we simply associate words with certain meanings depending on our individual experiences. The great danger that Locke saw is that every speaker may in fact associate slightly different meanings with their words, and so we might not really understand each other when we speak. But the typically German position that arose in response to empiricist arguments of this kind was to insist that there is at base some sort of necessary connection between words and their meanings. One of the most developed theories of this sort was what has been called the anti-semiotics of Wilhelm von Humboldt. Humboldt's view became part of the philosophical background to academic linguistics in Germany, the country in which the new discipline had its intellectual and institutional base. But Whitney was an American from New England. As the name suggests, this region in the northeast of the United States is the center of Anglo-Saxon colonial civilization in the New World. Stephen G. Alter, in his 2005 intellectual biography, William Dwight Whitney and the Science of Language, argues that the default philosophical position that permeated school and university education in New England during Whitney's youth was essentially a form of English empiricism. Specifically, Alter points to Scottish common-sense realism, an empiricist philosophy that emerged in late Enlightenment Scotland and is associated chiefly with such figures as Thomas Reid and Dugald Stewart. The Scottish common-sense philosophers continued the idea that language is essentially arbitrary, but some, Alter points in particular to the lesser-known figures Hugh Blair and George Campbell, added the notion that language is also conventional. So according to this view, while language is arbitrary, that is, there's no necessary connection between words and their meanings, it's still conventional. That is, we agree as members of a speech community to associate the same words and meanings. By inserting the pressure of convention, the common sense philosophers were able to rescue arbitrary language from the danger Locke envisaged, that there would be no agreement on the meaning of words. Although common sense philosophy, and indeed other forms of empiricism more generally, formed the background to Whitney's education, it was often seen as rather unsophisticated in Germany, and even went out of fashion in the English-speaking countries in the 19th century. In 1875, Steinthal responded to Whitney's critiques of his psychological theory of language, and used this occasion to criticize Whitney's underlying philosophy. Steinthal was not impressed by Whitney's common sense theory of language. He charged that Whitney was merely a naive and simple-minded American who didn't understand the epistemological and metaphysical problems addressed in German philosophy. This particular ad hominem charge may not have been entirely fair. Like many highly educated Americans of his day, Whitney had in fact studied in Germany, where, among other things, he attended courses given by Bopp and Steinthal in Berlin. Whitney had most certainly made an effort to enter the exalted intellectual world of mid-century German linguistics, with all its philosophical flourishes, although the sobering influence of Anglo-Saxon common sense was clearly stronger. However, the controversy between Whitney and Steinthal wasn't simply a matter of philosophical differences. There was a very real element of personal antipathy in their exchange. Steinthal closed his response to Whitney with a further ad hominem attack. He said, "Whitney has nothing at all to do with common sense, induction, natural science, or history. These are only shields held up to cover his haughty vanity. We are dealing here with a snobbish and pretentious individual of unrestrained pride." Steinthal's assessment on this point may not have been entirely unfair. The unrelenting ferocity of Whitney's polemics against Steinthal and other contemporaries would seem in no small part to be motivated by Whitney's jealousy of the popularity of others' ideas in comparison to his own. If we now return to the substance of Whitney's linguistic theory, we can make a few further observations about his view of language change as a gradual process brought about through the continuous action of speakers. In the passage we quoted earlier, Whitney said that we need to put off speculation about the origin of language until a later date, and focus on the forces acting now which are constantly shaping language. Whitney's target here is, of course, the various ideas about the origin and evolution of language put forward by Humboldt, Schleicher, Steinthal, and others. We'll recall from episodes 3 and 6 that Humboldt and Schleicher both imagined a prehistoric period in which human languages formed, which is distinct from the present historical period, in which, according to Schleicher, languages now degenerate. Whitney's approach, which insists on constant, unchanging factors that are the same now as they were in the past, represents an adaptation of the doctrine of Uniformitarianism, which was originally developed in geology. Uniformitarianism became definitively established in geology with the publication of Scottish geologist Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology in 3 volumes from 1830 to 1833. Whitney cites this work at a number of points in his writings. Whitney's educational and family background exposed him to these ideas. The natural sciences featured prominently in his school education, and his elder brother Josiah was a geologist who worked for the United States Government Survey to explore potential mining regions. Whitney accompanied his brother on some of these expeditions and participated in recording various scientific observations. The geological doctrine of uniformitarianism holds that the changes we see in the Earth's features are best explained by appealing to constant forces that have been acting in the same way since the beginning of time up until the present day. The trick is that these forces act gradually, so much so that the changes that are constantly taking place in the Earth's crust are imperceptible to us on a day-to-day basis. But over the course of millions of years, they create the mountains and valleys, seas and deserts that we know in the world. The view against which Lyell was arguing is catastrophism, the idea that individual events, catastrophes, bring about sudden changes in the form of the Earth. For example, volcanic eruptions or earthquakes can bring into existence or destroy islands. As a scientific principle, uniformitarianism has the great advantages of empiricism and explanatory economy. We can extrapolate from what we observe happening in the world today to explain history. We don't have to invent otherwise unknown and unproven forces to account for changes attested in the historical record. The catastrophic mode of talking about the history of the Earth, on the other hand, fits in well with the traditional account contained in the Bible, which is laced with dramatic events that change the world from one day to another. The most obvious example would of course be Noah's flood. This mode of telling the story of the Earth also fits in well with biblical chronology, because it allows us to assume that changes could have happened very rapidly at some points, more rapidly than they happen now. This means that the world could have reached its current state in only 6,000 years, as is sometimes claimed on the basis of biblical sources. But catastrophism doesn't simply represent subservience to biblical scholarship. Even as European scientists weaned themselves off traditional interpretations of Christian scripture, the assumptions underlying older accounts were maintained in many ways. One prominent supporter of catastrophism, who was also a renowned modern scientist, is Georges Cuvier, who, as we discussed in episode 1, was a leading representative of comparative anatomy and an inspiration to the first comparative historical grammarians. Catastrophism still has a place in geological theory today. For example, a widely accepted account of the great extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period, which killed off the dinosaurs, holds that the extinction was triggered by a massive asteroid impact. This is, of course, a catastrophic event by any measure. Recent crises of just the past few months may even lead us to think about the possibility of catastrophe bringing about our own extinction. So Whitney's extension of uniformitarianism to language is to say that we should imagine languages to be a gradual accumulation of individual communicative acts which are in turn governed by constant laws of human interaction. We shouldn't imagine a distinct prehistoric period with its own unique principles in which language came into being. Rather, there's a sense in which language is constantly being invented, because when we use language, we're always negotiating our communication with one another using the accumulated means provided to us from previous uses of language. In fact, Charles Lyell, in his 1863 book, The Geological Evidences of the Antiquity of Man, had preempted Whitney and extended uniformitarianism and the principles of Darwinian evolution to suggest a theory of language change along the lines worked out by Whitney just a few years later. Like Whitney, Lyell imagined change in language as the result of variation and selection. Among linguists too, Whitney was not alone in this new pragmatic conception of language, and his ideas were eagerly taken up by young scholars seeking to revolutionize the field. In the next episode, we look at one group of young scholars in Germany who were greatly influenced by Whitney, the neo-grammarians.